After I graduated, I got a job as a junior sales associate for a telecom company. This was around the year 2008, so it was standard practice for everyone to actually go into the office. Our office was very traditional. It looked like a scene right out of the movie Office Space. The main room was mostly cubicles, with a few offices on the far end that management used. It was a drab place, and I didn't love going there, but it was my first big girl job, and I was happy to have it at the time. In addition to the uninspiring scenery, the corporate culture there was also traditional. I had to address my boss as Mr. James, instead of using his first name, like most places would do now. Things were also very formal with my coworkers, and everyone was careful not to get too personal, even over lunch. The whole environment felt very fake, like everyone was afraid to be themselves. I was no exception though, and I went along with it, falling in line with the others. It was during my first week there that I met Alex, who was one of my coworkers. We'd exchanged small talk a few times, but nothing more. We sat together at lunch a few times, and talked a little, but mostly about work. Alex was about 35 years old, and he'd been with the company for over 10 years, but he was still in a junior position. I never asked why, because that seemed too personal. One weekend, I went out to a bar with my friends. It was a pub mostly, but there was also a DJ and a small dance floor on the far end. My friends and I had a table, but then a few of us decided to get up and check things out. It's when I saw Alex, the guy from my work. We recognized each other right away. He seemed different in that context, so we struck up a conversation. I talked to him for 10 or 15 minutes, then excused myself to go back to my friends. As I was walking away, he stopped me and asked to add me on Facebook. I didn't see the harm, so I told him my full name so that he could look it up. Remember, this was 2008, so most people did not have the ability to use Facebook on their phones. I was using a flip phone back then myself. When I got home, I opened my laptop and I saw that I had a new friend request. It was from Alex, so I accepted and then went to sleep, not thinking much of it. When I went back into the office on Monday, things were the same as usual. I saw Alex around here and there, but nothing stood out. It was like we hadn't even seen each other on the weekend. That was fine with me, because I was happy to keep things professional. He was a lot older than me anyway, and I wasn't looking to make any new friends at work. It just seemed smarter to keep those separate, especially because of how tense our office was. When I got home from work that day, I saw that Alex had began messaging me on Facebook. Mostly just mundane things, but there was one that was concerning. There was a picture of me sitting at my desk at work. It was taken from around the corner, and I didn't notice it at the time. I knew he took it that day, and it was weird. It was like spying. I guess he thought it was funny in some strange way. Over the next few days, his messages became increasingly personal, uncomfortably so. He'd comment on my appearance both in and out of work, mentioning outfits I'd worn days ago, or places he'd seen me on the weekend. That was when I started to get scared. All the while, when we were at work, he barely talked to me. In fact, it seemed like he was even avoiding me slightly. It was like there were two completely different sides to that guy. Or maybe he was just keeping up a professional appearance, so he could deny it later if I told anyone. Then, the stalking started. It began subtly. I'd see him at the coffee shop near my apartment, a place he'd have no reason to be. I'd notice him walking past my building, always at times when I was coming or going. Each sighting sent a chill down my spine. I confronted him about it, first through messages, but when that didn't work, I talked to him in person. We were in one of the break rooms in our office, and I said to him, I think it's better if we keep our relationship professional. He denied the whole thing, though. He was pretending that none of it happened. Alex was trying to convince me that I was crazy, but I knew he was messing with me. One evening, I was returning home from a late night at a friend's place. The streets were dark and mostly deserted. As I approached my apartment building, a figure appeared out of nowhere. It was Alex. His face was partially obscured by a hood. His eyes were fixed on me in a way that made my stomach drop. He stepped towards me and said,
"Hey, just want to talk."
If we were going to talk, then I don't know why he would approach me alone on a dark street. That was scary. It also meant that he was following me, and I was beyond terrified being alone on the sidewalk with him. I didn't want to hear what he had to say, so I turned and ran, with my keys clutched tightly in my hands. I dashed towards the entrance of my building, and I could hear his footsteps behind me. He was chasing me. I fumbled with the door, and thankfully, it swung open. I quickly pulled it closed and made sure that I locked, but I didn't look back to see if he was still coming. I just ran up the stairs to my apartment and locked the door behind me. It was only then that I allowed myself to acknowledge the full gravity of the situation. He had tried to kidnap me. I called the police, and Alex was eventually apprehended. It turned out that I wasn't his first target. There were others who had reported him to the police. In the end, he was charged with stalking, and our Facebook messages were the key piece of evidence. Otherwise, the police wouldn't have had much to go on. Alex was also let go from our company when the charges were filed. It was the scariest time of my life so far, but all things considered, it turned out pretty well for me. Not everyone is so fortunate. I have a few hobbies that I'm pretty into, and one of them is restoring old cars. This one is a hobby that turned into an obsession a few years ago. I'm not a mechanic or anything, so I need help with that part of it, but I'm able to do most of the cosmetic stuff, including paint, which is pretty tricky. Scrolling through Facebook Marketplace had become a daily routine, hunting for parts that would fit my project at the moment. That day there was a listing for the exact parts I needed, and they were local. To say that was rare would be an understatement. Normally I would have to pay for shipping to get specific things like that. The seller Chris responded quickly to my message. We chatted for a bit, and he invited me over to check out the parts. I thought that would be great, because I could make sure they were the right ones before paying. It was late on a Saturday afternoon, so I went right away. It was only a half-hour drive. Arriving at his place, I found a typical suburban home, nothing out of the ordinary. I parked on the street and went up to the front door. I rang the bell, then Chris answered and we shook hands. He was in his 50s, overweight, and about 6 feet tall. I was 42 and much smaller. We immediately launched into car talk, sharing stories about our projects. He led me into the garage where the parts were stored. Everything was neatly organized. Several of the parts were exactly what I needed, and they were all in good condition. I was ready to wrap things up, pay for the parts, and head home, but Chris insisted that I stay a bit longer, to talk more, and maybe share a drink. He was friendly, and it was always fun to meet someone who shared one of my hobbies. To be honest, I really wanted to go, but I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed to hang out for a while. I followed him into the house, and he told me to make myself comfortable in the living room while he went to get us some drinks. It felt like any other home I had been in, but I couldn't shake off a growing sense of discomfort. It was weird to be alone with a stranger. I had met people online for deals many times, but things had never gotten this personal. I waited in that living room for 5 long minutes, and when Chris returned, he handed me a cup. It was a red plastic cup, like you would see at a frat party in college. I thought that was weird, because the house looked pretty nice. It'd be really strange if he didn't have any real glasses. I looked into the cup and saw a dark liquid with a white foam on top. I asked Chris what it was. He said it was red wine, but I immediately knew something was off. First, the foam looked odd for wine, and second, when I took a sniff, it smelled more like grape Kool-Aid than any wine I'd ever had. I looked back at Chris, and he was staring at me in a strange way. When we locked eyes, he turned away and took a sip from his drink. I was way too creeped to stay any longer, so I simply put my cup down and walked towards the door. I didn't even bother to excuse myself. In any other situation, it would have looked rude. As I was walking through the hallway, Chris ran up quickly and positioned himself between me and the front door. I didn't want to escalate things. I just wanted to get out of there. "Just getting some fresh air," I said, hoping he would let me leave. But Chris didn't move. I told him again that I was leaving, this time more assertive. I knew I couldn't take him in a fight, and I didn't have anything to defend myself with. Just my keys, but I knew that wouldn't be good enough. Even still, I reached into my pocket and gripped them tight, with one sticking through my fingers. Just then, Chris took a step forward, towards me and away from the door. That left a small space, just enough for me to squeeze through. I pushed past him and made it through the opening. There was just barely enough space for me to get the door open. I burst outside and didn't stop running until I reached my car, locking the doors the second I was inside. I looked back and saw him standing in his doorway. but he didn't chase me after that. My heart was racing as I drove away. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see him following, but there was no one. I drove around a little to make sure that I wasn't being followed, and then I went home, trying to calm down after what had just happened. Once home, I called the police. They said they'd had other reports of suspicious activities linked to online sales. Turned out that somebody else had reported Chris. There's another man who had escaped from Chris's house, but he had actually taken a sip from his drink, felt the effects of whatever was in it. With my statement, the police had enough to search the house. Eventually, I got a call from the police. They had investigated Chris, found a stash of drugs in his house, along with evidence that he had been drugging and robbing people who came to buy things from him. He was arrested and charged with multiple crimes. It was a relief that he was caught, but I couldn't help but blame myself for being so stupid. I knew better than to be alone in a stranger's house, but in that moment, I still did it. I moved to a new city when I was in my early 30s. My plan was to buy a house in the area, but since I was coming from a different state, I didn't want to just choose a place randomly. Instead, I thought I would get an apartment first and keep an eye on the real estate market. Since I didn't know when something good would come up, I didn't want to commit to a full year lease. It's always possible to find a subletter, but I wanted to avoid that hassle, so I was looking for a place that would let me do month to month right from the beginning. I was searching on Facebook mostly, because there were some smaller independent buildings listed there. The big corporate landlords all had a strict one-year policy. I did eventually find something that looked alright. It was a smaller building in a residential area. The neighbors were all single-family houses, and it had a good suburban feel, even though it was not far from the city. The building had 3 floors, and only 2 apartments on each, so 6 units in total. The rent was cheap, and they only asked for a 3-month commitment. The unit was also furnished, so that was a plus. That was a good enough compromise for me. The chances that I would buy a place in that amount of time seemed low. The apartment itself was unremarkable, but fine for a temporary setup. The walls were a bland off-white, furniture was old and worn out, and the view from the window was of the neighbor's window. But it was functional and close to the city, which is all I really needed. The building was old and had a big double glass door at the front that the residents used. There were no electronic locks, just keys. Also, I didn't see a single security camera in the whole building. It was quite outdated for the time, because most buildings had better security than that. Since it was furnished, I showed up with very little. I didn't meet any of my neighbors, which was fine by me. I liked my privacy. Most of my days were spent exploring the city and looking at real estate. I had narrowed down my search to a few areas. One morning after a late night, I was jolted awake by a hard knock at my door. Rubbing sleep from my eyes, I stumbled to answer it, not sure who it could be. Standing there was a man with a toolbox in his hand. He introduced himself as the maintenance guy for the building. He was around my age, 33. He was about 5'8", but looked tough, like the kind of small guy you wouldn't want to mess with. Maybe it was the tattoos that gave him that impression. This guy was covered in them. His ink extended all the way to the bottom of his chin, and there were a few small ones on his face. I had never met this man, but being new to the building, I didn't think much of it. He explained that there was a reported leak in my apartment that needed immediate attention. His tone was urgent, so I stepped aside and let him in. The apartment wasn't large, so I hovered in the living room while he made his rounds. He checked under the sink, around the bathroom, and even peered behind the fridge. He was thorough, I'll give him that. He mumbled something a few times, and then without saying much, he left. I remember feeling a bit uneasy after he walked out. The visit was abrupt, and in hindsight, a little odd. At every building that I'd ever lived before, they had to give you some notice before coming in. In any case, I went back to bed, determined to get a few more hours of rest. When I finally woke up later that day, something about the morning's visit nagged at me. I had decided to call my landlord, just to make sure he was actually working for the building. I got the landlord on the phone, and explained to her what happened that morning, expecting her to confirm that it was the maintenance guy. But when I finished talking, she told me there was absolutely nobody working for her who matched that description. In fact, my landlord told me that her son does all the repairs and maintenance, and he didn't match that description at all. Didn't have a single tattoo. Also, there hadn't been any reports of leaks in the building. I think he was probably some sort of thief that knew I was new to the building. He probably watches the postings on Facebook, and then shows up knowing the person is new and won't suspect a thing. That would make sense, because I later found out from my landlord that none of my neighbors got a visit from him. It was just me. It was pretty obvious that the man wasn't there to fix a leak. He was scoping my place out, probably for a robbery. Lucky for me, I didn't have anything expensive at all. He would have seen that when he was in my place, so at least he knew that I wouldn't be a good target. Makes me wonder what he would have done if I had an expensive laptop or other valuables. Maybe he would have held me up right there, or maybe he would have come back at another time. Given that he had a large toolbox with him, it does make me wonder what was inside. My guess is that it wasn't tools. I used to run somewhat of a business out of my home. I ran an online store and sold used music gear, mostly guitars. I always kept an eye on the used market, and I had a pretty good eye for what certain things would sell for. So if something came up for sale at a good price, I would simply buy it, and resell, and hopefully make a bit of money. I wasn't getting rich or anything, but it was a fun side hustle, and I got the chance to check out some cool stuff along the way. I would use Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and some other websites for international shipping. I preferred to deal face-to-face though, so it was primarily Facebook and Craigslist. I had a townhouse downtown in a major city, so it was usually easy to make deals since so many people came through my area. My place was on a side street, just off one of the busy roads. It was not a gated community or anything like that, just a unit in a row of townhouses on the street. My living room window was about 20 feet from the sidewalk. It was a Tuesday when I got a message from a guy interested in one of my more expensive guitars. His name was Travis, and he looked real. He had a decent Facebook profile that was over 10 years old. We chatted back and forth, and I gave him my address so he could come and check it out. We set a time for later that evening, then I went back to work. When the time came, I waited, looking out the window every once in a while. There was a car circling the street that I thought might be him. It was an older silver SUV, and I saw it pass my window at least 3 times. At one point, I even went out and waved at him to let him know it was the right place, but he kept going. I went back inside, a little embarrassed for waving at some stranger. I thought Travis was a no-show, not too unusual in this business, and I didn't think much of it. The next night, I was in my living room on my laptop, with the TV on as well. I had a movie on, but I was also replying to some emails. The clock was edging towards midnight, and I was getting tired. I got up from the couch and walked towards my bathroom. That's when I saw a person standing outside my back window. It was too dark to see what he looked like, but it was not usual for someone to be there. The back was gated off, and strangers were not supposed to come in. It was my private patio, so whoever was there, they were trespassing. I turned off the TV, then heard a faint scraping sound, like metal against wood. I was a little scared, but still didn't think it was anything serious. But then when I peeked around the corner again, I saw the back door was slightly ajar, and then in the doorway was a figure. A tall, thin man, dressed in dark clothes. Seemed like he hadn't noticed me yet. I then shouted, "Hey," a pathetic attempt to sound intimidating. I was trying to sound angry or tough, but my voice cracked slightly, and it came out sounding very weak. The figure froze, and then slowly turned towards me. Our eyes met, his partially hidden behind the shadow of his hood. There was a moment, which was brief and tense, where neither of us moved. Then, as if someone had hit play on a paused scene, he bolted. He didn't come towards me, thankfully, but he turned and ran out the back door where he came from. I chased him to the door, yelling as loud as I could, hoping to alert the neighbors, or at least scare him enough to think twice about coming back. I slammed the door shut and called the cops. When I took a closer look at the door, I saw there was some damage, and I couldn't get the deadbolt to slide into place. It looked like it had been pried open. The cops came, and we talked for a while. They did a quick sweep of the area, but the guy was long gone. One of the officers said it was probably a random break-in attempt. At one point in our conversation, though, I told them about my little business. I told them that I sell expensive stuff out of my place. With that information, the officer said that doing things like that can attract thieves. It actually makes sense, because I was basically advertising to the world that I have a lot of expensive stuff in my house. Then giving out my address like I did makes it even easier. I gave the cops a list of people who had contacted me, but they never made an arrest. I think it was that guy from the night before, because the timing makes the most sense. Whether the silver SUV had anything to do with it, I'm not sure. It seemed that they might have been scoping it out for the next night, but I never saw that SUV again. The incident left me paranoid for a while. Never felt safe in that house again. There were a lot of people who had my address, and I was worried about getting robbed by that same guy, since he was never caught. I moved to a high-rise building a few months later in order to have better security. I was renting, so it was not a big deal to move. I kept up with my side hustle for a few more years, but began dealing more online. As it turned out, the money was better that way, so there really was no reason to risk meeting strangers in person.